Hey there everyone. Today we're going to learn how to manipulate the space of objects in web. Hope you'll join. Hello there everyone. I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're going to be focusing on display and position within CSS. With these new tools, we'll be able to manipulate anything in whichever way we'd like. Today we're just going to be learning the basics and gaining a base understanding of what each of these display options and position options do. And next episode, we'll focus on using those properties, as well as finding tricks and best practices for how to use them. So to begin with controlling display and position, let's go ahead and actually define the difference between them. To begin, let's start with display. When it comes to the display property in CSS, display essentially lets us lay the ground rules for our page, element, or block. With display, we're essentially taking control of the playing field, kind of like how in football you'll have certain arrangements based on the, I have map in my mind, but in this case it would be the field. Just because of the different ground rules of essentially the field, like in sports, we have a different way to organize things. And that's exactly what we're doing with display. We're setting a stadium with ground rules on how the players, or the position of the players, will be essentially followed and how those rules will apply to the players. Now, position literally can translate into that idea of the players that we have. With position, we're individually manipulating the space of an object. Usually, you'll find that with position, you'll be moving things on a Y and X axis, but you can essentially think of the difference between display and position as display being the ground rules and the way to organize things, and position being the individual characteristic and or movement of a single element. Now that we have a basic understanding of the difference between display and position, let's go ahead and take a look at this first example that I've created on the most basic form of display in web, which is inline. Inline was what was originally introduced when the web first existed, because the web was originally just text. And because of that, most inline in HTML will follow like so. With inline, you'll find that there is no defined width or height for an object. It just follows, trying to go to the left and to the top, just in the same way that we read a book. So no matter the case, items will align first to the left and then to as high as they can go, and they'll follow in this order. For example, when we're looking at this code, I've created an element within this element, and later when we discuss block, you'll see that things won't line up in this fashion. So for inline, think left and top. Now to move forward, we'll continue on to the block display method. So with block, as you can see on the screen, we actually have the ability to define a width and a height for our elements. In the previous code with inline, we saw that no matter the rule that we had applied, it went from left to right with complete disregard for our width and height. And with block display, we can literally control these elements as blocks that have dimensions. Still, we'll find that within the block, you can still display in an inline fashion, like so. However, in block, we actually have control of dimensions. Let's move on to the next one. So for our next block, we're actually going to be doing a bit of a mix-up. With inline block, our next display property, it takes a bit of the best of both worlds when it comes to both inline and block. With inline, it's really easy to manage content because you always know the way it's going to act. With blocks, you find that it's easy to control the size of things. However, it can be a bit annoying when blocks automatically jump to the next line, even if you want them in the same position. So, inline block allows for us to have multiple blocks that will stack, hopefully, right next to each other. Let's have it pop up, and just like that, like inline, we have our blocks go top and left, but now we actually have the ability to control the width and the height, or the dimensions of the objects. So up until now, I've been discussing older display properties that have been around for a long time. Now, come past 2010, the web community decided to introduce two new concepts that would make the organization of a lot of content a lot easier, as well as giving web developers an option to better control things. And those two new introductions were Flexbox and CSS Grid. Now, let's go ahead and start with Flexbox. With Flexbox, we essentially introduced a system that allowed for us to control things instead of just from the left and the top, to actually switching over to a system that allowed us to essentially control the direction of the items that we wanted to control. So the large thing to take away with Flex will be the idea that we have control over the columns, as well as being able to convert them into rows. Now, with this kind of control, we can really take advantage of having to design things for mobile. So let's go ahead and transition over and learn about a basic understanding of CSS Grid. CSS Grid, we're able to really define a grid. You can think of essentially having complete control of the columns and rows with CSS Grid. Alongside this, we can actually define areas and tell blocks which areas they should go in. So, for example, you can see that even though I have these two blocks in here and have simply just given them IDs and classes, and they're displaying with their initial, they're displaying with CSS rules that give them a coordinate grid to follow. So, with CSS Grid, we can define something close to a coordinate grid, kind of in the way that Battleships works, and tell each of these individual players to take their places through these coordinates. Now, that defines most of our display properties, so let's go ahead and transition over into position so that we can individually control each of these blue blocks within the red one. So to begin with position, we're going to start with the most basic type of position, which is static. The static is the inherent property that you'll find with most HTML elements that will essentially just do what it means. It means that a block is static. It will stay in place according to the rules that it's given based on the display at the time. So, without that out of the way, let's go ahead and move on to positions that give us control. Our next display property is going to be absolute. With absolute, we have a property that, let's go ahead and set the position. And for our position, I'll go ahead and say absolute. And with this, our blocks will follow a rule that allows for us to actually manipulate their position and have them stay on a page no matter how you scroll. So with this, we have control of how far they are from the edges of the screen. So let's say we want our block to stay in place as we scroll through a page. That block will stay there no matter what, even if the red block that is in control of it, or its parent element, moves in some cases, depending on which parent it has selected. So, to put it in simpler terms, with absolute, our block will absolutely stay in the same position relative to the left, top, bottom, or right of wherever the block is. Next, I'll touch on absolute's very, very close brother, fixed. With fixed, we're actually able to add things like navigation bars on websites that stay in the same place on your screen no matter where you are on the page. So for example, if I switched from absolute to fixed for this element, we would find that the blue block stays in the exact same position, again, based on a scale of how far it is from the top, or the left, or the bottom, or the right. So, main difference you'll find between absolute and fixed is that fixed will stay on the same relative space no matter where on the screen you're scrolled, whereas fixed will stay in the same place on the page within context of the entire page. And now to classify our final position, we'll go ahead and take a look at sticky. Now, with sticky, what we have the ability to do is take an element that we want to stick along with us throughout the page and have it follow us around and essentially create this mixed state of fixed and absolute. So, until we drag past a certain point, our element will stay fixed, absolute, until it hits a point of 0 from the left part of the screen, at which point it becomes fixed. And in that case, we essentially have a sticky element. So now we've classified all of our display and position properties. In the next episode, we'll focus specifically on how to use them, as well as why we use certain display and position properties when it comes to certain types of websites. So if you join us next time, we'll go ahead and take a deeper dive. Until then, have a nice day.